Hi, welcome back. Welcome to the fourth part of the family, gender relations, and reproduction chapter of the Marxian economics. As I said in the first part, we were making a review of the historical foundations of Marxian economics, and I was talking on empires. I basically have told you the function. It creates some kind of widespread coordination over a vast area. Economic coordination between different places. But I also have told that the function of the empires were not as widespread as it was in the early 19th century, and especially in 20th century. They were not controlling necessarily the education system. They don't have a widespread education system at least, even though maybe they might create some independent organs of the empires, like some religious foundations. Religious sects might kind of prepare some school network, although largely technical education at least was done in towns by they were organized by guilds. And in many ways, actually, religious sects were also there were separate religious sects spread to the country. Even though even today, some religious orders mimic that those separate educational institutions, and even today's independence of the universities actually come from there. I mean, before that, of course, you don't have universities, but you have monasteries, which kind of some of them turned to the university-like structures, which were actually organizing education. Even in Turkey, actually, many of those monasteries had evolved to some of the most prestigious schools in Turkey, which were initially protecting Christians in Turkey, like Saint Benoit High School, for example. So state has not a widespread organization of education which was not organized centrally, basically. Similarly, the healthcare system was not organized that way. So basically, we have several functions we see as certain functions of state were not there, and the separate part of empires were mostly independent economically. I mean, economically, not necessarily not independent, but autonomous. And this was more so for the villages. Villages were very much self-dependent, except maybe, just maybe, even there, just maybe, the state might give some protection to the villages from, for example, potential invaders. Although that protection itself was mostly focused on towns, at least towns, not the villages, for the most part of the story. So, how did this system transform? That's the next question. And of course, I'm summarizing it, but in a very, very short summary, which we will see a little bit more detail again from a different dimension in the next part, basically development part of this course. But you might say that it started with 16th century, where the European economic system becomes more, population increases, needs of the people increases, the land becomes not anymore. So there was difficulty of basically the productivity could not pace with the population necessarily that much, but more importantly, the trade between the states had become more developed, and at that time, the European countries have discovered the American continent, and they very fastly, two states basically, Portugal and Spain, had done it. They had colonized a significant portion of the continent, although their penetration was again not necessarily that deep. But this has created new markets for Europe, and this has created a cycle. Basically, the demand for the goods that were produced in towns were increasing. So the towns demanded more people, which they could not get immediately. However, still to some extent, the population of towns were now able to increase slightly in time, and they were able to sustain that population. And in return, they were demanding more industrial output from them, from the villages. Now the villages, they had a feudal type of structure where basically the low status people were producing the food, and then that food was part of this food was given to the landlord. Similar to if you watch the Zürt movie, there you can see the same logic, and the landlord might sell part of that grain. But now the landlords wanted to plant not grain, but cotton, for example, or other products that can be processed, that are inputs or industrial inputs in the cities and towns. But when you plant cotton, previously you were just able to give the output to your villagers. Now the output, the villagers might not necessarily able to sell that output, so you need to give wages to them. At the moment you start to give wages to them, then you start to think, well, maybe same work can be done with less amount of villagers. So suddenly the landlord said, okay, previously you were seeing me as a community leader, as kind of a paternalistic leader of the village, but now I declare this land is mine. And the moment the property relations started to emerge, the landlords were the first ones who could get the property rights. Previously that was irrelevant, basically. Even in the American continent, when people first go and say, I want to buy this island, Manhattan, the people living in Manhattan, the Native Americans, said, well, probably I don't understand what that means. I mean, how can you own land, basically? Land is something you just go wander and then continue to move on. It's not something you own. So probably they want our permission to use that land, and they give to us as kind of goodwilling. I mean, they want to show that they want our permission, and in return they want to give us something. But actually, owning land means no Native American can now enter to the Manhattan. They realized it later. Similarly, I mean, that ownership of land was something alien even to the feudal society in Europe. So now the landlords started to get the ownership of land and then expel the serfs. Something that happens, same process happened in Turkey in 20th century. The serfs, the villagers, they went to the cities. Well, cities needed a large amount of labor force, but initially they were not able to use this labor force. Why? Because that labor force was unskilled. But the craft production was the skilled type of production. Well, now this beautiful transformation Adam Smith has taught us take place, and basically the production system becomes skilled. I mean, so the new innovations make the skills more and more unnecessary for the production process. So in time, which takes a long time, these initially useless people in the cities become useful, and they become employed by them, by new now factories, not anymore workshops, and they provide the cheap labor force, which kind of was one of the elements that made the Industrial Revolution possible. So, as a result, first, in the towns, the production becomes large scale. They were not anymore serving just the immediate villages, but a large area. In return, they become dependent to the demand of that large area. So the towns and cities become more and more dependent to the long distance, the demand in the long distance positions of the world. This happened before only for some cities that were organizing trade, for example, Athens, for example, Tyre. But now this was true for the towns in whole country, in a very large area. I mean, whole Britain was a country like that, who was dependent to foreign lands to survive, because it produces the products that it sells to other countries, and it needs products to come back to Britain. So in ancient Greeks' time, Sparta has isolated Athens from land and sea, and this small area was so dependent to the foreign lands it starved, actually. In modern times, same thing was done by the Germany to the Britain, which starved the whole Britain, so Britain became now dependent. And in the meantime, previously villages were independent, but now villages themselves become more dependent, because increasingly they were not producing any more grain, but rather they were producing products that are used as inputs, basically, and in return they got money and they got what they need. Although still, of course, self-sufficiency level of the villages still remained, especially in traditional places. As I said, in Turkey, it still, I mean, their dependency was less than the dependency level in the cities. But even the villages and towns become dependent to each other. So this way, the feudal, the self-sufficiency in the feudal era turned to the dependency that is experienced in the capitalist era. And both production in the cities, the industrial production in the cities, which resembled industrial production in the towns, and the farm production in the villages had transformed and become more, resemble more and more the wage labor. Although, well, some farmers who were able to get their private property rights, basically, maintain in Europe at least and in some countries the family farming type of structure. Although those family farms had their own difficulties, because whenever there's industrial farming in the country, I mean, they were competing with those family farms, so they need either a separated, isolated market to survive, or alternatively they should promote their products in different ways. I mean, like saying more healthy than the industrial output, for example, they can say. But especially if the country maintains some isolated spots, if the transportation is not good, ironically, not good transportation allows those small farms, family farms, to survive, because they got some isolated markets to themselves. But that's the very summary of the way feudal system has transformed to the capitalist system. So now we can go to the family. Well, and there maybe the first thing we should say is both in the mainstream school and the Marxian school, family is kind of like a black box. So in mainstream school, you have family as an agent. I mean, it replaces sometimes the individuals. And basically, it has resources. It basically sends these resources to the market, and in return, it gets commodities. What happens inside the family, we don't know usually. But sometimes we use, for example, we see, for example, how family use its own, labor resource. For example, if it has 5 people, which one will be employed? How many of them they will send? For example, when the wages develop, they keep their children inside of the family, not working, because go send them to school, because that gives them more utility. But we don't see the production done and the distribution done within the family extensively in mainstream school. We basically say a black box which sends resources to the market and gets commodities or goods in return. In Marxian school, well, we are coming to the 15 minutes mark, so let's talk Marxian school in the next part. So see you in the next part.